The silence that morning was unusual. It carried a different intensity. She, who for years had walked in darkness, experienced the light with the serenity of someone who no longer needed to announce anything to anyone. She had kept the miracle that had transformed her life a secret, choosing not to immediately reveal the recovery of her sight. Every detail of the house, every shadow, every face that had previously been denied to her now unfolded before her eyes with painful clarity. There was no rush, no explanation, only the certainty that she needed no words to expose the wounds he himself had inflicted with arrogance and contempt. As he walked away with firm steps, without hesitation, the atmosphere in the room changed. He, always haughty, the man accustomed to command and being obeyed, suddenly found himself paralyzed. The impact of realizing that this woman, previously seen as fragile and dependent, was leaving silently with the dignity of someone finally free, hit him like an invisible blow. His heart, which had so often ignored her worth, now beat in despair, and his legs, once a symbol of strength, gave way. On his knees he begged, not with the voice of one demanding, but with the desperation of someone who knows he has lost what he can never regain. The scene was a cruel mirror, the powerful man reduced to the silence of regret, and the woman who once knelt for him, now lifted up by the power of her own liberation. And in that devastating contrast, a thought hung in the air like an inevitable sentence. When the hidden truth comes to light and pride turns to dust, is it possible to reverse what has already been lost forever? If this story has captivated you so far, subscribe to the channel, like it, and share it so that more people can be moved by stories like this. Before that night when the truth was thrust upon her, Ye-rin had already built a life marked by quiet dedication. Born in Busan, she grew up in a simple home where the smell of the sea mingled with that of freshly cooked rice and the constant sound of waves crashing against the pier. From an early age, she learned the value of humility and perseverance, helping her parents with small local businesses, always smiling and willing to give more than she received. Blindness came as a cruel blow in her youth, the consequence of a disease that silently worsened until it completely destroyed her vision. Even so, Ye-rin never allowed herself to be defined by darkness. She walked the familiar streets of Busan with confidence, memorizing every corner and every step as if the city were an extension of her memory. Her neighbors admired her for her courage and the gentle way she approached life. Her strength lay in simple gestures, like listening attentively to each person who reached out to her, or preparing meals that warmed even the coldest hearts. It was during this vulnerable period that she met Kang Min-ho, an ambitious young man, recently graduated from Seoul. He had traveled to Busan for work and was captivated by the sweetness of this woman who, despite being blind, seemed to see into people's souls better than anyone. At first, their romance seemed like a modern fairy tale. Min-ho took her by the hand, describing every scene, every detail of the capital's bustling streets. And Ye-rin, in return, offered him absolute trust, believing that together they could face any obstacle. They married young, and Ye-rin left her hometown to join him in Seoul. At first, her life was filled with small gestures of love, preparing breakfast perfectly by touch and smell alone, memorizing the furniture arrangement so he wouldn't trip, and even memorizing his calendar to remind him of important appointments. Her world was limited by darkness, but her heart overflowed with light. She unshakably believed that this love would be eternal. She never imagined that the same man who once made her feel protected would become her greatest tormentor. The blind trust she had shown would become the sharpest weapon against her own dignity. And as she recalled those early days of total surrender, Ye-rin could not have foreseen that the sweet, faithful woman she had been in Busan would give way to a new version of herself, shaped by the fire of pain and the light of truth. Because the man who once swore to love her would begin to feel ashamed of the very woman who honored him the most. When they arrived in Seoul, the world looked promising for Kang Min-ho. The son of an ordinary family, he had invested everything he had in a technology project that began in a cramped room with only a few used computers and ambition boiling in his veins. Ye-rin was by his side every step of the way, even blind, offering words of encouragement and a home that was a refuge amidst the daily struggles. While he spent sleepless nights closing deals and convincing investors, she waited for him with warm meals, reminding him that behind the struggle lay a greater purpose. The years passed, and the sacrifice bore fruit. The small software company grew into a corporate empire, and Kang Min-ho's name began to circulate in the corridors of power as a synonym for success and innovation. He became a frequent guest at events at the Lotte Hotel. Gossip columns chronicled his bold investments, and even politicians sought his influence. However, along with the recognition, something else began to grow, an inordinate pride that made him look back with contempt. It was at this point that Min-ho began to feel ashamed of Ye-rin. At gala events, while executives paraded with elegant wives in haute couture gowns, he would take her, but he would make her sit at distant tables, away from the spotlight. Her silence, once admired as a symbol of strength, began to be interpreted by him as weakness. It was as if the brilliance he had achieved could not be shared with a woman who, in the eyes of society, carried a limitation. Little by little, excuses emerged. First, they were late-night meetings that required her to be present, then endless business trips. It was during one of these absences that Ye-rin entered the picture. Young, ambitious, and cunning, she knew how to exploit Min-ho's vanity, offering him a poisoned admiration that stroked his ego. She didn't love him, but she knew how to make herself indispensable, and he, blinded by pride, failed to notice the trap that was slowly closing. Ye-rin, still blind, noticed only the changes in her husband's tone of voice, the prolonged silences, and the coldness that replaced affectionate gestures. Even so, she remained steadfast, believing it was just a passing phase. While he dressed in tailored suits and strutted his stuff for the cameras, she continued to take care of the house, the small details he no longer valued, but which were the essence of who she was. Min-ho's empire grew, but with it, the distance between them grew. The man who had once promised to hold her hand in the darkness now hid it as if it were an inconvenient secret. And it was in this chasm that the first cracks formed that would later become irreparable wounds. And while pride fueled Min-ho's heart, Ye-rin would learn in the cruelest way possible the weight of silent contempt. Over time, the small cracks in Ye-rin and Min-ho's marriage grew into deep chasms. What were once silences filled with weariness became silences filled with contempt. Social gatherings, which should have been celebrations of the company's triumphs, became stages for humiliations disguised as jokes. At a dinner with investors, Min-ho handed Ye-rin a bottle of wine and asked sarcastically to pour the glasses. She, feeling her way carefully, approached the table and, feeling the cold glasses between her fingers, began to slowly fill them. The muffled laughter of some guests cut through the air as a few drops fell from the glass, and Min-ho himself shamelessly remarked aloud that his wife wasn't even fit for that. Every word, every gesture was an invisible blade plunging into her soul. Ye-rin, always present on the most important occasions, took advantage of these moments to cast venomous glances and subtle comments, as if to remind everyone that his legitimate wife was nothing more than a bothersome shadow. Still, Ye-rin didn't react. She remained silent, sitting in the corner of the room, listening, absorbing, allowing her dignity to be her last armor against the mockery. In the privacy of their home, the situation was no different. The apartment, which had once been a refuge, had become a prison. Min-ho would arrive late, permeated by his lover's perfume, and didn't even bother to hide it. He would pass by Ye-rin without a glance, without a word, as if she were invisible. Her days were reduced to the sound of the door closing in the morning and the echo of silence at night. Even so, she prepared his meals, organized his clothes, and maintained his routine, as if there was still hope that at some point he would awaken from the arrogance that consumed him. But Ye-rin wasn't naive. She knew the whispers she heard at parties, the pitying looks, and the hushed words were well-founded. Everyone around her could already see what she couldn't: the disdain of a man who had become a slave to his own ego. It was as if the whole world already knew about the betrayal, except her. And when the truth finally came to light, it would be too late for any return. Because the silence she endured each cold night would soon turn into the night she lost everything except her dignity. The night that broke out began like so many others. The Lotte Hotel was packed with businessmen, politicians, and influential figures in Korean society. Min-ho, as usual, walked around the room with his chest puffed out, displaying his position of power, while Ye-rin followed him silently, wearing a simple dress that contrasted with the other women's jewelry and luxurious clothing. She had grown accustomed to being invisible, but that night, something different was in the air. The gala dinner was more than a celebration. It was a showcase. Min-ho knew this and made a point of showing off alongside his lover, Ye-rin, who moved around the room with ease, as if she were the true lady of the night. For Ye-rin, every step was silent torture. Hearing the laughter, the whispers, and feeling the pitying glances was like walking on shards of glass. Even so, she remained by her husband's side, believing that the simple act of being present was already a demonstration of loyalty. When the main courses were served, Ye-rin surprised Min-ho with a carefully wrapped gift. She had spent weeks preparing it. It was a personalized fountain pen, engraved with his initials, purchased with the small savings she had kept secret. It wasn't just an object, it was a symbol, a reminder that she had supported him through the darkest days, when there was no luxury, no wealth, only dreams. She handed him the gift with trembling hands, smiling shyly, as she whispered that it was a symbol of their love and the journey they had built together. For a brief moment, she thought Min-ho would be moved, but his response was an irreparable wound. Min-ho opened the package in front of everyone, looked at the pen, and with a sneer dropped it on the table. In a voice loud enough for everyone around to hear, he blurted out, "Is this what you think I deserve? A cheap souvenir for someone like me?" The silence that followed was more painful than any words. Ye-rin, with a venomous smile, raised her glass and murmured, "Maybe it's time for someone worthy of you to be by your side." Ye-rin felt her heart rip into 1,000 pieces. The entire room seemed to be watching her, some with pity, others with indifference. There were no screams, no reaction, only a look of pain that she tried to hide as she picked up the fallen gift. Her breathing was heavy, but her silence was deafening. At that moment, Min-ho declared the breakup. He turned to the guests and brazenly declared he was tired of carrying a burden. Amidst the clinking of glasses and stares, he declared that he had no need for a fragile wife who only embarrassed him. Shock rippled through the hall, but no one dared intervene. Ye-rin stood slowly. The sound of the chair scraping echoed through the luxurious hall like a farewell. There were no tears on her face, only the silent dignity of someone who had already lost everything but her essence. The cane in her hands trembled, but her steps were firm as she walked away. She didn't look back. She didn't plead. She didn't argue. She simply left behind the man who had turned her into a shadow. That night, she returned home alone. The cold apartment felt more suffocating than ever. The memory of the humiliation still burned in her mind, but something inside her remained intact. The certainty that even if everything had been stripped away, her dignity would never be taken. And ironically, it was in that moment of deepest pain that a flame of transformation began to silently ignite. The blind, submissive woman who had walked beside Kang Min-ho no longer existed. In her place emerged someone who still didn't know who she was, but who would no longer be a prisoner. And while Min-ho celebrated the cruel victory of his arrogance, he had no idea that the very woman he had driven from that life was about to rise from the ashes. That night, after the public humiliation, Ye-rin walked alone through the streets of Seoul. The biting cold seemed to pierce her skin, but what truly froze her was the emptiness in her heart. Each step echoed as if the entire city were mocking her pain. She passed illuminated shop windows where couples laughed carefree and felt the cruel contrast between the happiness of others and the abyss into which she was plunging. The dress she had worn to dinner, once a symbol of her hope to impress her husband, now felt like heavy armor, imbued with the contempt he had heaped upon her. In front of everyone, the days that followed were even more devastating. The Gangnam apartment, with its glass walls and designer furniture, became a prison of silence and bitter memories. Min-ho didn't return that night, nor the following. He was immersed in his own arrogance, enveloped in Ye-rin's constant presence, as if his wife had ceased to exist. Ye-rin, abandoned and blind to what remained of the future, locked herself in the dark room and let her tears flow unobserved. It was during this period that he decided to withdraw completely. With the help of a small clinic in Incheon, he sought refuge from the glare of society. There, between plain walls and silent corridors, he faced endless nights of pain and memories that burned like open wounds. Each morning he recalled Min-ho's cruel words and his lover's venomous laughter, and no matter how hard he tried to erase those images, they returned with even greater force. Yet, even amidst the suffering, there was a flame that refused to be extinguished. Ye-rin didn't want to be remembered only as the blind wife who endured betrayal and humiliation. Her dignity, so violated, still breathed within her, begging for a chance to rise. It was in this silence that she began to gather strength. There were no clear plans, no defined destination, only a firm decision. She would not remain fallen forever. And so, amidst tears and lonely nights, the seed of her transformation was born. A seed that would grow in secret, far from the eyes of the man she believed had destroyed her forever. Because while Min-ho believed Ye-rin had disappeared amidst grief, in reality, she was preparing for a rebirth that would change everything. The days in Incheon stretched out like chapters in a silent book, but it was there, far from the spotlight and her husband's oppression, that Ye-rin began to chart her turning point. The isolation, which at first seemed like cruel punishment, became an opportunity to look within and rebuild what had been broken. The white walls of the small clinic reflected not only her pain, but also the possibility of starting over. For the first time in years, she was free from Min-ho's accusing eyes, the whispers of arrogant guests, and the suffocating presence of her lover. It was in this setting that he met a doctor named Dr. Han Soo-kyung, a specialist in ophthalmic surgery. A firm but calm-spoken woman, she recognized not only Ye-rin's physical condition, but also the emotional burden she carried. At each appointment, she not only treated her eyes, but also offered words of encouragement, as if sensing there was more to this patient than the visible scars. Ye-rin heard for the first time in years someone tell her that hope was not a burden, but a force that could guide her. With the few resources she had secretly saved throughout her marriage, Ye-rin decided to take a risk. He underwent a delicate surgery, the outcome of which was uncertain. The days of recovery were marked by darkness and silence, but a darkness unlike any he had ever known. It was the darkness of waiting, of the possibility of something new. Every time I removed the bandages for examinations, I felt my heart race, fearing frustration, yet yearning for light. And then, on a calm morning, as the winter sun streamed through the clinic windows, Ye-rin opened her eyes and saw a figure that slowly became clear. The doctor, smiling before her. The world, until then composed only of sounds, smells, and tactile memories, revealed itself once again in colors and shapes. The tears that flowed were not of sadness, but of rebirth. For the first time in years, she saw. And with that vision, she also saw the truth she needed to face. The following months were spent in intense rehabilitation. Learning to walk with sight again was almost as challenging as living without it. Ye-rin rediscovered the streets, the markets, the parks. On one of her first outings, she walked through the Insadong neighborhood, where the narrow streets were lined with artisans, cafes, and art galleries. With every detail she observed, she felt like a child, discovering the world for the first time. The texture of the ceramics, the vibrant colors of the fabrics, the reflection of the paper lanterns illuminating the night, everything seemed to carry a profound meaning. But more important than seeing the world was how he saw himself now. She was no longer the fragile woman who depended on her husband for guidance. She was someone capable of walking alone, of deciding her own destiny, of keeping secret the greatest weapon against the man who had crushed her. Because Min-ho believed she remained in the darkness, isolated and invisible, unaware that each day Ye-rin was reborn in silence, strengthened by the truth she carried in her eyes. What Min-ho didn't know was that at that very moment, as he was intoxicated by power and luxury alongside his lover, the wife he had scorned was shaping a new version of herself. Stronger, more serene, and more dangerous than he could ever have imagined. And as Ye-rin walked through the city rediscovering life, Min-ho's empire began to show the first cracks that would change everything. While Ye-rin was silently reborn, rediscovering life with her own eyes, Kang Min-ho was enjoying a period of apparent glory. His name was in the newspapers, his image was plastered across the covers of business magazines, and his technology empire seemed invincible. However, like any edifice built on arrogance, the cracks began to reveal themselves subtly, almost imperceptible at first, but devastating in every detail. The first blow came from where he least expected it: international investors. Accustomed to ever-rising numbers, they began to notice strategic flaws and hasty decisions. Min-ho, intoxicated by self-confidence, ignored advice and persisted in risky projects, convinced that his genius was enough to sustain any downturn. Meetings that once ended in applause began to end. In uncomfortable silence and suspicious looks replaced enthusiastic greetings. Within the company, the climate deteriorated. Employees murmured in the hallways, reporting late pay and inhuman pressure. The environment that once vibrated with innovation had become a constant field of tension. Many began to abandon their positions, taking with them secrets and information that further weakened the corporation. Ye-rin, the lover who claimed to be his inseparable companion, proved even more ruthless in this scenario. While Min-ho struggled to keep up appearances, she demanded expensive gifts, luxury trips, and exclusive dinners. Instead of providing support, she became an even greater burden, pressuring him with constant demands. When business began to falter, her patience began to evaporate. Venomous remarks emerged from her lips, making it clear that her loyalty was tied to wealth and power. But the most painful blow came neither from the investors nor the mistress. It came from Home, little Han-jun, the couple's son, suffered in silence. He missed his mother, asking for her every night and crying over her inexplicable absence. Minho, accustomed to ignoring feelings for the sake of his career, couldn't handle his son's pain. For the first time, something inside him wavered. Seeing the boy holding a child's drawing, showing his mother smiling and holding hands, he felt a pang he couldn't ignore. The drawing showed only two figures, Han-jun and Ye-rin. His father was gone. These moments began to erode the fortress Minho believed he had built. He still presented himself in public as the unbeatable man, but in private he suffered fits of rage and sleepless nights, unable to comprehend how everything was beginning to slip through his fingers. The empire he had built with such pride seemed to be crumbling, and the loneliness, disguised as power, became increasingly suffocating. However, what Minho could never have predicted was that while he desperately tried to keep up appearances, the woman he had despised and driven from his life would soon emerge not only as someone renewed, but as the key to a future that would crush him. Because just when Minho thought he was losing everything, he would discover that the biggest blow was yet to come, and it would come from the very woman he thought was fragile. Time had passed, but not statically. While Minho sank into increasingly visible crises, Ye-rin flourished in silence. Her recovery was not just physical, it was emotional and spiritual. With her sight restored, she saw not only the world through new eyes, but also herself with unprecedented clarity. The woman who had once accepted humiliation as an inevitable part of married life now walked with a steady serenity, shaped by suffering and strengthened by overcoming it. The successful surgery and Dr. Han Soo-kyung's support opened doors to new opportunities. During her rehabilitation, Ye-rin connected with groups that helped people with disabilities reintegrate into society. There, she met investors in architecture and interior design, a field she had always been fascinated by, even though she couldn't see. With quiet dedication, she began studying, first absorbing information from books and lectures, then applying her natural talent to small projects. What began as a personal refuge quickly turned into a promising business. Her life in Incheon was soon replaced by a new routine in Seoul, but this time no longer as a shadow. Ye-rin had become a partner in an investment fund that invested in emerging companies. Her discretion, combined with sharp intelligence, earned the trust of business people who sought more than appearances. No one suspected her true identity. To everyone, she was simply the elegant Mrs. Lee Ye-rin, a quiet investor who preferred to let her actions speak for herself. And so, unexpectedly, their paths crossed again with Kang Min-ho's. His company, once solid as steel, now faced the brink of bankruptcy. In a risky move, he sought support from outside investors to save the international contracts that were slipping through his fingers. Secret meetings were scheduled, and tension hung in the air, foreshadowing an inevitable outcome. On the decisive morning, Min-ho entered the conference room of Gangnam's most luxurious hotel, trying to maintain his proud bearing. He wore his usual impeccable suit, but the deep circles under his eyes and the tension in his shoulders betrayed his weariness. In front of him, a long table awaited the key investors. Among them, one figure caught everyone's attention. A woman dressed in white, with an erect posture and a calm gaze, wore sunglasses that hid her eyes. Ye-rin. Min-ho's heart raced, but he tried to hide it. He couldn't believe that presence was real, and as the meeting progressed, the surprise reached its peak. The mediator announced that the new majority partner of the investment fund that would come to save the company was precisely that woman. Ye-rin stood elegantly, slowly removed her glasses, and revealed her bright eyes that now stared at everyone present. Silence fell over the room. Executives who had never witnessed such a symbolic scene stood still, Stunned by the shock of the moment, Min-ho, for his part, felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Before him was no longer the fragile wife he had scorned. There was a strong, self-possessed woman, now in a position of power. His lips moved, but no words came out. Only the dry sound of his breathing betrayed his desperation. Ye-rin, who accompanied him, paled as she realized the tables had turned. Ye-rin, serene, didn't need fiery speeches. Her presence alone crushed Min-ho's pride. With a few words, she announced that she was there not to destroy, but to invest. Because unlike him, she knew how to recognize value even in what seemed to be in ruins. Her words, firm and calm, were like a silent sentence. Min-ho lowered his eyes, and in that gesture there was more defeat than in any financial failure. As the meeting closed under the weight of that revelation, it became clear to everyone that true power lay not in accumulated numbers, but in preserved dignity. Ye-rin had returned not as a victim, but as the protagonist of her own story. But if Ye-rin's reappearance before everyone already seemed like the final blow, what was to come would make Kang Min-ho kneel like never before. That same night, after the meeting that sealed the fate of his company and his standing before investors, Kang Min-ho returned home with heavy shoulders and a troubled mind. The glass apartment in Gangnam, once a symbol of victory, now seemed like a bright, cold and empty mausoleum. Every corner echoed the echo of a life built on arrogance and contempt. Sitting in the leather armchair, still dressed in his impeccable suit, he felt the lump in his throat grow to the point of almost suffocation. Images of the meeting replayed endlessly. The moment Ye-rin removed her glasses and revealed the brightness of her eyes, restored by surgery, was a memory that burned within him. She was no longer the blind wife he had scorned, but a renewed, serene, powerful woman. And he, before her, was nothing more than a man defeated by his own arrogance. The clock was almost midnight when the doorbell rang. Min-ho rose with heavy steps, his heart racing for no apparent reason. Opening the door, he found Ye-rin standing there, dressed simply, but with a posture that exuded strength. There was no anger in her expression, only the cool calm of someone who no longer carries open wounds, but scars that tell stories. For a moment, Min-ho wanted to speak, to justify himself, to explain the inexplicable, but nothing came out. He just fell to his knees before her, as if the weight of the years of humiliation he'd made her suffer had finally turned against him. Tears, which he'd never allowed anyone to see, flowed uncontrollably. The powerful CEO of Seoul now begged like a broken man, asking for something he could no longer achieve. "Ye-rin," her voice cracked. "I messed up. I messed up so badly. Please give me a chance." Her silence was deafening. Ye-rin simply stared at him, her eyes steady and serene, without a trace of artificial pity. In that look, a clear message was conveyed. The time for pleading was over. Min-ho wept more than ever, remembering the days when she waited for him with warm meals, the moments when she held his hand in the darkness, and the unconditional love she had squandered in exchange for vanity. His words became desperate. "I can't do it without you. I need you, Ye-rin. Please don't leave me alone." But Ye-rin didn't answer. She walked slowly to the living room table and rested the cane she had once carried as a symbol of her fragility on it. He watched her silently, understanding that her gesture was not just a reminder, but a warning. She was no longer the woman he could dominate. Min-ho's crying echoed through the apartment, mixed with the distant sounds of the city that never slept. Cars passed, lights flickered, but inside, the world seemed still. Ye-rin took a few steps toward the door, and he, still on his knees, reached out in a pathetic gesture as if trying to grasp the past that was already gone. There were no shouts, no fiery speeches. Only a heavy silence, crueler than any declared revenge. Minho, kneeling, begged for something that would never return. And Ye-rin, in her unshakable serenity, knew that the most devastating moment for him was not his rejection, but the realization that there was nothing he could say or do to change his fate. What remained now was not the hope of reconciliation, but the irreversible pain of a belated regret. Minho had not only lost his wife, he had lost the woman who, even blind, had seen him better than anyone else. And now, as she looked at him with absolute clarity, he no longer had a place in her life. But if Minho's regret seemed like the inevitable end, Ye-rin still had the final decision to make, and that choice would be more devastating than any rejected plea. Ye-rin stood in front of the door, breathing deeply. Behind her, the sound of Minho's crying filled the glass apartment, mingling with the distant hum of the city. It was as if, for the first time, this space reflected not the power and luxury it had always boasted, but the utter emptiness that accompanied the fall of a man who believed himself invincible. She slowly turned her gaze to him. Minho was still on his knees, his face streaked with tears he'd never admitted to shedding in front of anyone. There was no longer any arrogance, no longer the mask of the haughty CEO, only the fragility of someone who finally understood the price of his arrogance. For a moment, Ye-rin wondered if it was worth saying anything, if there was a need to shout or expose all her wounds in words. But the answer emerged within her with the same serenity that had guided her transformation. No. Silence carried more weight than any speech. She walked a few steps until she stood before him. Their eyes met, and in that instant, Minho seemed small, almost unrecognizable. Ye-rin didn't speak of past hurts, didn't enumerate betrayals, didn't recall humiliations. Instead, she spoke only one short but devastating sentence. "Take good care of what's left." The words hung in the air like a final sentence. There was no anger in them, only the realization of an inevitable truth. She was no longer there to support him, to protect him, or to fill the void he had created. What remained in his life, whether it was the crumbling company or the loneliness that would accompany it, was what he must learn to bear. Minho tried to react, tried to reach out again, but Ye-rin had already stepped away. Each step toward the door sounded like a hammer sealing their fate. As she crossed the threshold, she didn't look back. The silence she left behind was crueler than any words. The man who had always believed he controlled everything was now trapped in his own regret, and his greatest pain wasn't the loss of his wife, but the fact that nothing he said could bring her back. In the bright hallway, Ye-rin took a deep breath. She felt the weight of years of humiliation melt away with each exhale. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't payback, it was freedom. She had made her choice, and that choice was simply to move forward, leaving behind the past that had nearly destroyed her. And as Ye-rin departed in silence, only one question remained in the air. What fate would await each of them when life finally took its toll? Months later, Ye-rin's life had completely transformed. On Jeju, the island where the sea meets the wind and flower fields stretch as far as the eye can see, she had found the refuge she had always sought. The small beachfront house lacked the luxury of Gangnam's apartments, but it possessed something infinitely more precious: peace. Every morning, Ye-rin woke to the sound of waves gently lapping against the rocks and Hanjun's innocent laughter running through the yard. The boy, now happier, discovered in his mother's gaze not only affection, but also a strength he had never seen before. Life in Jeju was not marked by extravagance, but by simplicity. Ye-rin worked as an interior designer, a profession she embraced after her recovery, finding beauty in every space she transformed. Clients who sought her out saw in her not only talent, but also the serenity of someone who knew pain and had learned to transform it into art. Her eyes, once dulled by darkness, now exuded confidence and hope, illuminating the spaces she touched with an indescribable energy. Meanwhile, in Seoul, Kang Min-ho's reality was quite different. The empire he had built was crumbling with each passing day, eroded by debt, scandal, and the loss of credibility resulting from his rash decisions. The company's once crowded corridors were empty, and the investors who had once fawned over him now avoided him. The luxurious apartment had become his prison, a silent space where only the memory of Ye-rin seemed to inhabit. Every night the scene of her silent departure returned like a relentless shadow. His mind relived the moment when, kneeling, he begged, and she simply turned away. It was a punishment that needed no words, because her absence was the final sentence. The contrast between their destinies was proof that life demands every choice. Ye-rin didn't have to destroy anything with her own hands. Min-ho had built his ruin alone, brick by brick, with each act of arrogance and contempt. She, on the other hand, rose above the pain and found a path to freedom. Poetic justice lay in the way each continued their journey, she in peace, he in torment. At the end of each day, as the Jeju sun set, dyeing the sky gold and red, Ye-rin would sit with Hanjun facing the sea. She would gaze at the horizon and feel that she had finally learned to see life in its fullness. She was no longer the blind wife carrying shame and pain. She was a whole, strong, and free woman. She didn't need to destroy anything. He built his own ruin with his own hands. And so the story ended, not with revenge, but with the truth that echoes in every heart. Dignity is the greatest weapon anyone can carry. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and share it with anyone who needs to feel this message. We still have many more moving stories waiting for you.